This time we're going to learn how to interpolate. And interpolating is to use a regression equation to predict a value between other values. So here we have our data of the hours of sleep the night before a test and the percent on the math test. And suppose we're interested in making a prediction based on the data and based on the line that fits the data. What would the math test score be if that person had 7 hours of sleep? 7 is between two of our data numbers, 6 and 8, and so we're going to interpolate from the equation to figure out the percent on the math test for 7 hours of sleep. So here are the things we would have already done with the calculator. We would have already gone to Stat and Edit and typed the numbers into the lists. We would have already gone to Stat and Calculate, and number 4, linear regression, and found the regression equation, and we would have already pasted that regression equation into the y = menu, and there are previous videos on all of those things. We probably would have already graphed, and so we have our scatter plot and we have our line of best fit. We don't need the scatter plot for what we're about to do. We could go to y equals, we could arrow up to where it says plot 1, and we could press enter and turn that scatter plot off. That's a shortcut for turning it off. We don't need it at all, and we don't want it to confuse us. So going back to the graph, we are looking for the y coordinate when the x coordinate is 7 for 7 hours of sleep. So we can press trace. We could scroll back and forth until we got to 7, but we might not actually hit exactly 7. We might get lucky, but perhaps not. It looks like we didn't get exactly 7. So that's not as accurate. Instead, we can press second, trace. That takes us into the calculate menu. Choose number 1, value, and just press 7, enter. Okay, so for 7 hours of sleep, it looks like 87.7% on the test based on the approximate coordinates of that point there. If we go back to trace, let's try something. We might have to quit and go back in. So I just pressed second mode for quit. I'm going to go back to my graph. I'm going to press trace. I was scrolling back and forth before. Could I just press 7 in the trace menu? Looks like I could. Some calculators maybe you can and some you can't, but instead of going into the calculate menu, I could have just pressed 7 while I was in trace, and it will jump to that point. That's the graphical way to interpolate. There's also a tabular way to interpolate. So to do this, we're going to use the table. Table is the second function of the graph menu. But before you go to the table, you need to go to table set, which is the second function of the window menu. So second window takes you to table set. The default settings are here. It starts at 0, it goes by ones. It automatically generates the x and the y. What we want to do is we want to be able to input whatever x value we want. So it's going to ask us for the x. So let's change independent to ask. Now let's go back to the table. So second graph takes us to the table. We can type in a 7, press enter, and there we see the percent on the test. What if we hadn't changed the table set? And what if we left it as auto? And we went into the table. That wouldn't be a problem for this particular exercise we're doing because you can see it's going by ones. We have a 7. And you get the same result. But in another problem, maybe you want 7.2, or maybe you want 136. And starting at 0 and going by ones is not the most efficient way to do it. So instead, if you do ask instead of auto, you can just type in exactly the number you want. So we have 2 ways to interpolate, using the graph and using the table. A third way would be to plug the number into the equation and calculate yourself.